Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to the show. And my guest in the studio today is Martin Aylward. Hi, Martin.
Hey.
And Martin is a Buddhist teacher who's been teaching retreats around the world for the last 15 years and has a particular interest in bringing Buddhist teaching into everyday life. And in today's interview, we're going to be talking about freestyle awakening. So, Martin, an obvious first question is, what do you mean by freestyle awakening?
Well, it really is a way of looking at the fact that there's these great traditions, both the big classical spiritual traditions, if you like, and all the traditions that grow up around particular teachers, etc., and how valuable that can be to have the support and the body of teachings and the commitment to that over years, And at the same time, the way that can often exert a subtle or not so subtle sense of limit, of dogma, of rigidity around what one's doing. And the freestyle referring to the fact that in the end, one has to find one's own way through, because, of course, the constraints one's dealing with, the limitations, the rigidities, are those of one's own consciousness. And so that can be pointed to in the broad strokes of the truths that different traditions and teachers might point to. And they have to be worked out in in one's own consciousness.
Yeah.
And so it's like there's a certain truth to that saying, that there's one true way, and yet it turns out that the one true way has to be your own way.
Yeah, and of course, there's a fascinating kind of tension, in a sense, between the challenge of following and the value of following a particular teaching and structure, even when there's a place in us that wants to run away and wants to do something different and wants to get away from it. And there's a value in staying with that. And yet there's equally a place where that can become oppressive. And there's another side of this equation where there's the kind of more following our own instinct and that being a positive thing. But there's also the place where it's a bit more like being a spiritual tourist and we just kind of drop into lots of things and never really deepen with anything. Do you see this having changed over the years? Do you see this? Because it seems to me that in more recent time there's a lot of a falling down of some traditional structures. Certainly Western religion, for example, it used to be very much there was a religion of a certain nation and that was the spiritual teaching. And there seems to be a great shift in that's happened. Do you see that having an effect in this area? Or?
Well, I think there's the appearance of that breaking down because of the internet and things, we've got access to a lot more, right? You can have access to a tradition or someone teaching anywhere in the world.
And anyone can start a tradition, right?
Whereas it used to be that really your access to wisdom, if you like, was whoever was the wisest person in the nearest sort of 100-kilometer radius or something.
Right.
So that gives the impression of that. And yet, throughout the history and all the different traditions, people are constantly innovating and updating what they receive in their tradition and kind of trying to articulate the actually inexpressible mystery of awakening and how consciousness transforms and what it opens to. Trying to articulate in such a way as to let that be felt and acknowledged and opened to by other people. And when people do that well and it touches many people, then that tends to form a tradition, which means it gets more codified and more ossified, and there's less and less room for freestyle often within that.
Yes.
And yet also sometimes people communicate their own understanding in such a way that it meets less people, or they're not on social media, they're just doing their thing in their little place somewhere with 2 or 3 students.
Right.
And there might actually be a room for a lot more freestyle there. There might be, because it doesn't get so codified. There's not so many people practicing the same thing. So I don't know that it's a new development particularly.
Yes, I guess it's just easier for someone to flit between different things because there are more things to follow. And I'm curious where you see the place of really staying with something, because I want to explore both sides of this equation, but the value in staying with a teaching, even when it's challenging, and certainly in more traditional context, again, this could be a whole discussion of itself, but the guru-teacher relationship, with the guru-student relationship, where there's somewhat of a surrendering to a teaching and letting go of that, just wanting to kind of, how do you see the value of that, but also the challenges of that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are kind of three broad phases to that. And initially, in the engagement with a teacher or a tradition, the broad strokes, the general teachings, and the application of the general practices can actually take you a long way, yes. I think. So by applying basic meditation instructions, by listening to the direction that a teacher is pointing their students in general in, you can start to notice a lot of your own patterning. You can notice the way your mind is unruly and tends to go here and there, and you can start to train yourself in steadying your attention, being more receptive and sensitive to what's happening emotionally and energetically and physically. Start noticing the way reality is around you and the way that you've experienced reality basically through your own assumptions and interpretations, yes. And start to have that clear away quite a lot. So I would talk about that as the first phase, if you like. Mm. And then actually the more you get in touch with a certain degree of freedom of being and fluidity, the more reality appears transparent, the more you're awake to your own more or less gross habit patterns and reactivity, yes. And able to leave them alone. That's when there's more need for a teacher. I would say somebody who can actually say, yeah, but what about this?
To show you the things you don't want to see. Yeah.
Or somebody who can reflect back to you the stuff that's more hardwired, that's so much a part of your functioning in the world that you just you don't see it as being just structural and conditioned.
It's almost habitual. Like it's the lens through which you see the world, right. So you can't see the lens because it is the lens through which you see things.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the kind of commitment and the kind of having a relationship to a teacher and being willing to do what she says or he says, even when you don't like it and when it pushes all your buttons, right. That's the potency of what we might call that second stage, if you like. And that tends to provoke a lot of fruits and therefore provokes a lot of love for the teacher or the tradition and the logos within which one's practiced. And it tends to then, if one's not careful, give rise to the view that, wow, this way is really great. Yeah. This teacher is the best teacher, or they've got the monopoly on truth in some way. And one gets a little rigid around one's own system, around the languaging of it, around the connection with one's own teacher, etc. Yes. And so that third stage, in a way, is what I mean by freestyle awakening, when one's willing to actually look in a fresh way, look through the eyes of a different tradition, be in contact with different teachings, put oneself in an environment that's not so familiar and cozy.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to put it, because correct me if I'm wrong, but my interpretation of what you're saying is that freestyling too quickly is a danger, because actually you need to go through that phase of being challenged and the stickiness. And if we're too free at that point, the danger is as soon as it gets sticky, we leave, as opposed to actually working through. But there's also a point later on in that evolution and development that actually we need to be able to then look at perhaps that teaching in a broader context. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, also I think it's a way of being able to work when one gets disillusioned with one's teacher, which we might say, well, that's if you've got a dodgy teacher, you'll get disillusioned with them.
I would argue you've got a human teacher.
Right.
You're going to find some areas that are not perfect. Right. That's the nature of life.
And I think there's two different sort of styles as well with this. Like for some people, it's really helpful, at least for a long time, to give oneself quite completely to a teacher or tradition. And for those people, if they start to look left and right, if they start to contrast and compare, they just get confused, yes. Or they get discouraged, yes. And they can't somehow reconcile that contradiction. And better then to keep it simple and do one thing and do it sincerely and wholeheartedly. Yeah. And yet for other people who have a tendency more to get rigid, that very same commitment and wholeheartedness with one thing can increase the sense of rigidity. Yeah. And for those people, then actually the sense of being willing to see how others are doing it can keep a sort of a freshness, and that you're referring back to your own processing of and digesting of teachings. It's like finding your way through the different styles and presentations and languaging, because of course things are languaged differently in different places, because everybody's, any tradition or any teacher is trying to do this impossible job of articulating the inexpressible, right? Of pointing in language and with relevant imagery and examples to an expanse and a vastness and an infinity and a mystery of consciousness that defies imagery and defies examples and not defies language, but refuses to be confined by it, defined by it, reduced by it. Yes. So all these traditions are kind of the best clumsy attempts people can manage to define the indefinable. Yes. And our path of practice, I would say, anyone, is to kind of be as receptive to those expressions as one can, to acknowledge their limitation and to feel for one's own way through, so that increasingly one's understanding and one's living of and participation in life, as it opens up more and more, becomes a kind of one's own direct expression of the inexpressible. Yes. And therefore there can be a great sort of gratitude to the teachers and traditions that have pointed that out to us, and yet without an adherence or a need for any particular teacher to be the right one or the true one or the best one or something.
It seems to me that part of that evolution in someone's relationship with a teacher or a teaching is, I think, there can be a tendency initially to see a teacher as having something that we don't have. And so the teacher becomes our way of getting that thing that we don't have. And I guess hopefully part of what happens in time is we realize that that thing that they have, we have, everyone has, is everywhere, that it becomes somehow that relationship becomes a kind of a conduit towards us finding that inside of ourselves. Is that fit? Is that what you're saying? Or?
I don't really.
Doesn't have to.
I don't really like the idea of the having something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to put it a different way?
In my own experience, I guess part of this comes, the use of the term freestyle awakening comes from the fact that all my three main teachers were all quite freestyle in a way. So one of them being a kind of very well-loved and venerated Thai monk and meditation master with thousands of devotees, if you like, but nevertheless, he was very iconoclastic and was quite shocking, Ajahn Buddhadasa. And he'd often really point people to their own adherence, to his own teachings as being in the way of where they were at. And then my Indian teacher, who was really very unknown and lived a very quiet life in his hermitage in the Himalayas, but was similarly kind of disdainful, or maybe not disdainful, but at least irreverent around the kind of slavish adherence to a body of teachings or something. And then my English teacher, who'd been also a student of Ajahn Buddhadasa, but was also kind of very slippery. I guess that sort of slipperiness, that refusal to land, is what I really loved and appreciated in all my teachers. Yes. And so what that non-landing was actually just a freedom of spirit, a recognition that what this is, this mysterious participation in life, can't actually be really named and codified and laid down. Yes. So, and yet the paradox is that one can grow and deepen and free one's understanding hugely through some of that codification. Yes. So I would say one needs to both commit and follow something and really let a practice and a teaching work on you, and at some point you have to really drop it as well and be willing to be bereft and not have the guidance of your familiar orientation and languaging and logos. I think there's a quote from Thomas Merton where he says something like, when all your practices have left you and your heart has turned to stone, then true prayer becomes possible. That's probably a very clumsy approximation of what he said, but there's something I think that's beautiful in that. It's like the point at which the practices that you've given yourself sincerely to and the teachings that you've loved, when they run out of space.
And there's something about penetrating the idealizations that we also project onto teachers and teachings, and which I think can be helpful at certain points, but also can be very unhelpful at certain points. I'm curious to explore more as well what I would, it may not be the right phrase, what I would call the spiritual tourism of kind of dipping into lots of different things and different things speaking to somebody, and maybe it is that someone's just not yet found their path or their teacher, as it were. But it also seems to me that there's something about that spiritual tourism which is also a reflection of some parts of modern life, in a sense, of just not really committing to something. I'm curious as to your thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, that what we've been speaking about in kind of inspiring tones, maybe a commitment and a wholeheartedness, that's hard work, and it's not very glamorous, because what that commitment reveals is all one's clumsiness and one's compulsions, and the kind of the wild and selfish and greedy, needy, lazy, crazy nature of my own mind. So it's more comfortable, in a sort of self-cherishing way, to kind of talk about meditation. It's much, it's very nice to talk about spiritual life, right? It's much nicer to talk about spiritual life than to expose oneself to just the reflective mirror of a contemplative practice that just shows you all the ways in which you keep falling into the same patterns and keep going down the same paths and keep reinforcing the same kind of tight self-sense.
It seems to me that a lot of things in our kind of current cultural paradigm, and one example being reality TV shows, especially kind of things like The X Factor, where it's like you get something quickly. It's like you discover this talent and you go on this TV show and you have $1 million or pound of a record contract, and there's a lot of stuff that seems to be out there around finding inner peace and instant calmness and this or that or whatever, which is very attractive to the kind of egoic kind of self. But actually, as you say, real spiritual transformation is just hard bloody work most of the time. And it'd be interesting just to hear a bit more about what you see of the qualities needed to sustain that kind of inner work.
Well, that's part of the value of a structure, right? That it holds you, and it holds you when you can't hold yourself. Yes. A teacher that'll kind of love you when you can't love yourself, and similarly will
slap you around the face.
Give you a hard lesson when you need a hard lesson, when you've gotten complacent in a way. So that's what I mean. There's a kind of the elements of both are really important, right? Otherwise, there's too much freestyle, right, and not enough awakening in that lack of commitment.
Yeah, and it seems sometimes there's a place where someone just needs to commit. I guess it's like intimate relationship. There's a point where you have to take that dive and commit to something. And I'm curious as to any advice you have for people sitting with that tension. It's like perhaps there's a teaching that they've followed for a while and it kind of speaks to them, but they're kind of a foot in, a foot out. How does someone navigate that territory?
I have no idea.
Great, thank you.
In a way, I don't know, because it's very, at least for me, I've never found it. I can't produce that commitment in myself. I'm useless at committing to anything, actually. But there's something when, it's not really for myself like the kind of the plugging in to practice and the just taking myself to the cushion every morning regardless of what was happening, and the kind of the willingness to do what my teachers told me to do even when it was uncomfortable. That wasn't, I can't really take the credit for that it was something about my commitment.
Sure.
It was something like the burn of the dissatisfaction of my own unruly mind just got bigger than the discomfort of just giving myself to something. So that's what I mean. I don't know what people can do other than the fact, even if you're just looking at one thing and looking at another and trying to figure out what to do, feel why you're doing it. Why are you doing it? You're doing it because of the burn of the dissatisfaction of living in your own confined consciousness. And the knowing somewhere that it doesn't have to be that way. The knowing that it's possible to actually inhabit life in a much fuller and freer way. And if you stay in touch with that possibility that you know, and that longing for that, listen to that longing, follow that longing, see where it takes you, and by staying in touch with that, whether it's found on the long straight line through one tradition, or whether it's found by navigating the thises and that's of all that's on offer.
Yes.
You know, that's what I mean by the one true way, that's your own way, right? It's following the burn of dissatisfaction and the intuition and a longing for something else and letting that carry you, because that's the support that can keep you in relation with yourself and with life, even when part of you, wants to withdraw.
Yes. Yeah. We're nearly out of time. It seems to me that burning desire or that hunger for truth, I guess it's there in everyone, but perhaps it's whether someone's really open to seeing that. We've only got a few seconds left, but I don't know if you have any comment on that.
That's a setup. If we've only got a few seconds left to speak about it. But there's a hunger and a burn in everybody. But it can get directed in a million different ways, right? So there's a point at which we kind of lose faith in the way our hunger's been directed out there, and we start to, for whatever reason, start to feel that it's to do with how I can transform myself rather than what I can get or get rid of.
Yeah, I like that. Thanks, Martin.
Nice.
Great. And thank you for watching. If you want to find out more about Martin, his work, his retreats, you can go to www.martinaylward.com. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye-bye.